Chapter 5, negligence. All right. So when you have a negligence claim, we have certain elements that you're going to have to meet every time. The first one is called duty. Okay. There's always going to be a duty. If there's no duty, if there's no standard of care that you have to meet, then you don't have a negligence claim. All right. Secondly, you have to breach that duty. So you're supposed to do something and you don't do it, right? Or you're not supposed to do something and you do it. But either way, you breach it, okay? You violate what you're supposed to do. Now, this can be an intentional act, and it usually is an intentional act. Sometimes it's going to be in what's called nonfeasance, where we don't act, we don't do something. Now, generally, nonfeasance is not going to be a tort, or is not going to be negligence. Why? Because generally speaking, we do not have a duty to protect people. We don't always have a duty to act. The general idea is that only in certain circumstances do we actually have a real duty to act. So if somebody doesn't act, then generally it's not going to be negligence. So if I'm walking along the beach and I see somebody drowning, right, it might be mean of me, but I have no obligation to jump in there and save them, right? I have no obligation. So let's say somebody drowned because I didn't go in and save them. That would be nonfeasance, right? So I didn't act. I didn't do anything. So am I negligent? And the answer is generally no, right? The answer is generally no. Now, in some circumstances, the answer is going to be yes. So let's say, for example, you're a camp counselor and you're at the beach and you have a bunch of kids with you who are in your camp, right? You're supposed to take care of them. If one of them is drowning, you probably have an obligation to go in there and rescue them. Why? Because in this case, you have a standard of care, right? That's part of your duty. So if you don't rescue them, you've breached that, okay? Now, there's also the third element called causation, all right? Now, causation means two different things, and we have to have both of them. The first part of causation is causation in fact, okay? This is the but-for test. So what this means is, did what I do cause the harm to you? And the answer is usually pretty clear. So let's say you sue me for negligence, all right? And you argue that I negligently went through a red light and I hit your car, right? So the question that you would have to ask is, if I didn't run through that red light, would I have hit your car? And the answer is no, right? I hit your car because I went through a red light. So that is causation in fact. So I have caused, in fact, the damage to your car because I went through the red light and that caused the damage. So now, the second thing is called proximate cause. Now, proximate cause means that the damage has to be foreseeable, right? There has to be something foreseeable about it. So take a crazy example, okay? Let's say you walk into the room and I want to play a prank on you, so I want to scare you, okay? So I jump out and I yell boo and I scare you, and you're freaked out. So you go running down the hallway, okay? And you run into the living room and you bump into your TV and your TV falls out the window and the TV shatters, and then somebody walking down the street steps on the glass and injures their foot, okay? Now, let's look at the but-for test. Did I cause, in fact, that damage to that person walking down the street? And the answer is yes, right? If I didn't hit you, then you wouldn't have run, and if you didn't run, you wouldn't have hit the TV, and if you didn't hit the TV, it wouldn't have fallen and broken, and if it didn't break, then the person wouldn't have stepped in glass. So yes, in fact, I did cause that damage. But is that really foreseeable? Meaning, is it fair to expect me to go through that whole scenario in my head in advance and say, okay, well, if I scare you, then this will happen, this will happen. No, that's not really foreseeable. So in that case, that person on the street cannot really sue me for negligence. Because, yes, I did in fact cause their injury this way, but I did not actually cause it that way. And lastly, of course, there has to be damage, okay? Damage basically is just that. The person has to be injured in some way, all right? So if you have these four things, you have a duty, you breach that duty, you cause some injury, you actually caused it and it was foreseeable, and there's some damage, then you have a negligence claim. So let's look at a couple defenses, okay? The first one is assumption of risk, all right? So assumption of risk means that somebody did just that. They knew the consequences of something, or potential consequences, and they engaged in it anyway, right? So the idea is that, let's say you're playing some kind of football, tackle football. It could be dangerous, right? We all know that. So if you get injured, if you get injured within the bounds of the game, you cannot essentially sue somebody for negligence if you get injured when they tackle you. Why? Because you assume the risk by playing the game. There's also something called sovereign immunity. Now, sovereign immunity basically means that you essentially can't sue the government. All right. Now, there's exceptions to this, but there can be statutes that negate the immunity. So the federal government can pass laws that say, okay, you can sue us in this instance or that instance. But generally speaking, the states and federal government have what's called sovereign immunity. Okay, you can't generally sue them. Third is official immunity, and this is immunity that that officials have. Okay, so you basically can't sue the governor, the legislators, or your council members if one of the laws somehow harms you. Now, the exception is if there's malice, right? If somebody is acting, in order to harm you, or they're acting outside the bounds of their job, then you can sue. And official immunity doesn't protect you. So that's why, let's say the governor is embezzling all this money, right? Or something like that, or the governor somehow steals something from your house, right? If the governor comes into your house and steals something from you, he doesn't get an official immunity. Why? Because he's not acting within his official capacity, right? And he's obviously acting with malice, right? It's not part of his job to come steal stuff from your house. So the last thing is to look at the schemes, all right? So how do the states deal with this? Well, there's two different kinds. Some states use what's called contributory negligence, and others use comparative negligence, okay? Now, contributory negligence is only used by a minority of states. I think North Carolina, Alabama, I want to say Virginia, maybe one other, but it's a small amount. Essentially what this means is that if there is any contribution to the negligence, it bars recovery. So the idea is that, let's say you were hit by a car, you're a pedestrian, you're walking down the street, you get hit by a car. Well, the jury decides that the car is 95% at fault, right? 95% at fault. Now you're 5% at fault because you happened to step on the curb a little bit. You weren't all the way on the sidewalk, okay? But nonetheless, the driver was drunk or whatever the case was. So they're 95% liable. The jury says you're only 5% liable. In one of these states, you're not going to win any money at all because you contributed to the issue, right? And therefore, you're barred from recovering anything. Now, what most states use is something called comparative negligence, okay? And that's what Missouri uses, by the way, in most states. Basically, your recovery is offset by your level of fault. So yeah, even if you're a little bit liable for what happened, it's kind of your fault to some extent. All that happens is your award gets reduced by that percentage. So take an example where, let's say the jury says you are 20% responsible for what happened, 20%. And they award you $1 million, okay? So because you're 20% at fault, they're going to reduce your award by 20%. So instead of getting $1 million, you're only going to get $800,000, right? But you're still recovering, right? You're just not getting the full amount because whatever percent you're responsible for, that percent of the award gets dropped off. So you don't make $1 million, you make $800,000 because you are 20% at fault. And that's in a comparative negligence state. So it's obviously important to know, what kind of state you're in, if it's a contributory negligence state or if it's a comparative state.